everyone. Yes, before you know it, term has started. So, this talk I'm giving you is about a simple exercise I conducted with a new module. We had 200 students taking an introductory ecology class, and I wanted to provide them with some ability to develop spatial awareness, because most of the time in the field, we can be in the forest, in the coral reef, they don't really know where they are. So this was made much simpler with the availability of Google Maps. So I introduced something called the map prac, and these are the 5 sections I'll go through: identifying the problem which provided the motivation for the exercise, what the 2-hour practical consisted of, and you know, if you provide an assignment, then everyone actually does it. But with assignments means marking, how do we cope with a class of 200, and some applications and further thoughts. So where are we is a really great question to ask when you're out somewhere. And this is NUS. So a simple map, and I ask my students, so where are we within NUS? We would imagine that we would be able to figure this out easily. So what helps us is the fact that there are delimiting roads. So on the top, that is Iraja Expressway, below Pasir Panjang, Clementi, Alexandra, and bisecting it is South Buona Vista. So once you recognize this rectangle, you'll be able to spot NUS in any map. And we have a bit of additional help these days with a $1 trillion container terminal. So if you're looking at a big map of Singapore, look for it, and then further up, you'll see NUS. So we're here. Right? Where are we right now will be, well, let's use a little bit more help. Within NUS, this is Lower Kentridge Road, this is Kentridge Road on the ridge, and this Kentridge Crescent. So you know when early man looked at the stars and they came up with constellations, so you can look at Google Map and see constellations to figure out where we are. So once you know this, it's a search image, and then suddenly you become more proficient. Now, what's the significance of this in ecology? Well, if you zoom out a bit more, you realize it's not just Kentridge, which is this little bit of high ground in Singapore. There's also Telok Blangah Hill and Mount Faber, right? So if you join it all together and you start with Clementi Woods, this is a nice ridge line extending all the way in the southern part of Singapore, with a little bit in Labrador and Sentosa. And what's significant about this ridge line? Well, Singapore is actually quite flat. If you turn around and look north, you can see all the way to Bukit Timah. So we've got a ridge line, a little hump in the center, and then it's flat all the way to Johor. Now, when you look around, you realize we have actually 2 mangrove fragments adjacent to NUS. So your perspective of space has to change. It used to say I have a class in arts, that's very far away, right? So, but when you look at maps, you begin to change that spatial awareness. Mangroves are almost entirely wiped out in Singapore, yet we have 2 little pockets nearby, which we can take a bus to in less than 15 minutes and reach and use for study. So this is the mangrove. And of course, once we realized it's nearby, we started bringing students for work. We even go there and do cleanup. That's me, realizing I'm not so young anymore. And if you scale it out even more, then you realize, oh, Sumatra is not so far away. So this ridge line actually buffets air up. It's traveling along the flat plane, hits the ridge line, goes up vertically, and birds like the black buzzard during the migratory season actually use it to gain elevation, and then they can head off to places like Sumatra. So this is a winter migrant. You actually can do very interesting bird watching at our backyard in NUS. It'll also help to explain why we see animals like this. This is a griffon vulture, and this is a NS boy at the time. You can see he's almost same size. Pretty impressive. So what's a vulture doing in Singapore? So if you scale out the map again, you can then see Burma, India isn't too far. If you add in the winds, then you realize they can get blown off course. And they've turned up about 4 or 5 times in the past 2 decades. So for the ecology student who's not even aware of the birds in campus, like kingfishers, this is quite an awakening. And the maps are a very important tool. It should be a basic vocabulary that they have, but it's missing. So this where am I problem, the motivation came a long time ago. At Czech Java in 2001, when we were trying to persuade the government that this was worth conserving, we did not just research, we also did public outreach, so thousands of people came. We got to talk to lots of Singaporeans, and they're out on an open space for perhaps the first time in their life if they are less than 30. They've never seen such open space in Singapore, and then they have a problem figuring out where they are. So this is where Czech Java is. And these poor guys, you know, these poor Singaporeans, they're looking out at a wide expanse of water and they think it's the South China Sea. It's actually the mouth of the Johor River. Then one day I had a question because they could see Pulau Tekong, and someone said, is it Sentosa? Because there are nice buildings there now. And then the one that really made waves was when a guy came and said, is that Borneo? Because I heard it's across the sea. So our spatial orientation perspectives, unfortunately, quite badly polluted because we are urban citizens. We have problems realizing that drain is the stream that leads to the sea. If you're at Buona Vista MRT, look at the monsoon canal, you'll see birds, maybe pythons if you're lucky. That leads all the way to Pandan mangroves. But we can't see the connection because everything's so built up. So this is Czech Java, and across you see Pulau Ubin, and that's the Johor River. So the sea is far, far away, right? Now, some of these apps, which are turning up in iPhones and mobile devices, are actually helping. But this is a friend of mine. He just went for a cycle this morning, and this is Runkeeper. He just turned his Runkeeper app on, put it in his pocket, went for a cycle. When he came back, it provided his elevation pace, I think even how many calories and his heart rate, which it estimates, of course. But if you ask him where exactly he was, could he describe the place? Actually, they don't know. The IT devices have distanced us from maps. So it gives you a plot of where you were, but where are you is still a bit of a challenge. We have a wonderful app called godare.sg. Just type in postal codes and it'll plot and even tell you the cost of getting to Sungai Buloh, right? But interestingly, geographers have realized, I'm not a geographer, I'm just a biologist, so I'm a geography map user, right? The geographers say navigation device can make it easier to navigate. People are less likely to learn environmental layouts and become overly dependent on devices. So this, for example, the way to Sungai Buloh, this is the shortcut. It's going to save you half an hour. You can avoid a bad traffic jam in certain areas. The spatial orientation of students on a bus is completely zero. They don't know how they got there, right? So the devices are helping a little, but they can also cripple them. This is a walk on Kentridge that we do to introduce them to plants. We've had to expand it because they didn't know that Kentridge Park is just across South Buona Vista, and there's a view of the southern islands. Remember that rectangle that was sticking out, the $1 trillion container terminal? It's actually a rectangle, you can see it here. Right, so you don't realize there's a ridge, although in our address it's Kentridge. And there's a pond in just behind Normanton. Many of them have said, I've never seen this before. And this is the little shortcut into Kentridge Park. The bent fences are, by the way, trees that fell down and cracked the railing. So how do we increase their spatial awareness? Because after they graduate, they still aren't aware of the surroundings. So there's a very simple map practical. In fact, my friends in secondary schools are going to adopt and do the same thing. And we didn't really have time, so I carved out one practical of 4 hours, split the group into 2. Each came for a 2-hour session. And there were 3 elements. The first thing we had them figure out was points of a compass. The big mistake is to make assumptions that they know the basics, right? So we went through this. And we did a task called boxing the compass. right? This was the basic skill of any sailor. He must be able to repeat the 32 points of the compass rose. We gave them a discount, it was just 16. So when they were talking to each other, rather than pointing to a map, they could say, north-northwest of this location is that. So how to introduce that to the vocabulary? We went to an ancient, I'm sure if the sailors weren't able to recite all of it, they got a whipping or something. We can't do that nowadays, so we have to appeal to their sense of self-worth or something. So they write it on a paper and then they try it out, and then they're excited because it isn't that confusing. And they begin to develop a grasp. So this is the simple compass that we use, right? Which they plot out and they figure out, and then they test each other. So that cuts down our need to go and assess every 200 individual. Then we get to introduce them a little bit more to a compass, and we ask them to go out to the extension of the lab where they can see all the way up to Bukit Timah, and they can see Bukit Gombak. They're telecom towers. So then they take a bearing, and then they figure out where they are. Then they climb up to the ridge, look the other way, where they can see the southern islands. Then they plot it on a paper map. Now, why a paper map? People who are digital enthusiasts will say, if it's in a computer, I don't need a paper map. A paper map is how many inch screen? Right? It's about this size. One problem of looking at digital maps is you lose your grasp of your surrounding. I mean, you can zoom out and all that, but we found getting them to plot it on a paper map and explore, it's like going to a library, exploring the shelves. You discover a much greater wealth. But the important thing is they work in a group, because then they talk to each other and the exploration is quite fruitful. So we give them a few pointers and then set them on their way. Of course, sometimes you get sabot this when the haze comes and you can't see Bukit Timah. I can barely make out the telecom tower. And the group work is then extended now, finally, to Google Maps. After they got points of the compass figured out, they have an idea of relative positioning, only then we switch them to a technological tool. Jumping to Google Maps immediately will actually not help them. So the fundamentals are down. First, find their own home. So each of them finds their own home, and then they describe their environs to their classmates. Because suddenly they have local knowledge. Suddenly they know more than the lecturer and the TAs and their peers. They have something to share because they've walked that area. So then that allows them to be confident about a new tool. And it's interesting when they look at the satellite map, when they figure out what things were. So that discussion is quite important. It's also something we do to get them to know their classmates. A lot of students don't know their classmates even in honours year. So we randomize all the classes and we do activities like this so that they actually speak to each other. They're not lawyers, so they're not so vociferous. Science students think too much and don't even know how to introduce themselves to each other. So once they got that going, then they are beginning to do plots. And again, we ask them to look for areas in and near campus, then around Singapore, and then out to southern islands. And the TAs move around and they have a conversation. So it's not much, it's more like facilitation, and they're fine. We asked them to make comparisons. We wanted to go and explore this rich resource of digital maps, but guess what? There's hardly anything around. Okay? So we are quite secretive about maps in Singapore, it seems. So iRemember is a National Library site. It's wonderful because you can call up any location and compare it with the 1935 map. The reason why they can put up this 1935 map is a taxi driver's map of Singapore. So they compare NUS then and now. And it gets them to realize, for example, why don't we see fireflies in our mangroves? Then they realize in Kuala Selangor, where David Attenborough went to film, the river is miles and miles long. And it's far upriver when the mangrove is becoming freshwater that you see fireflies. So they travel up a river in Singapore and they realize, oh, we've canalized it, right? So then it explains a lot of missing links. This is a map of Kranji River, and I asked people who came to the Sungai Buloh Anniversary Walk 1 year, what was different about this map? And then finally they realized the river flows out to the sea. In Singapore, we need so much drinking water, we've actually muzzled all our rivers so that it becomes freshwater reservoirs. So the sight of a river flowing out to the sea is actually a relatively rare one. Now, there was an excellent exhibition in NLB, which has been taken down. They are trying to explore if they can put this online. It's wonderful because there are maps and maps and maps. Do you know your topographical map of Singapore? It's produced by MINDEF. You actually can go and buy it. I had to go down to the airbase to buy it from the mapping unit, and they took my IC and whatnot and eyed me suspiciously because I was buying quite a lot. And it was the current edition of the map. We've gone through more than 10 editions so far. Guess what happens to all the previous editions? They get pulped. They are destroyed. So you can't go and buy edition number 6 or 5 or 4. Luckily in NUS we have geography department, so they have a map room, but I don't want to send 200 students there. So I just make do with 1935. So I'm hoping NLB will get the permission to put up these maps. So you can see things like this, right? Which this was Pandan Mangrove. It's a tiny strip now, and this was it a long time ago. So then they understand when they see records from 1960s describing a mangrove profile that they can't correlate with what they're seeing now. So the context is very important. Okay, so you know, with every exercise you must provide an assignment that gives them the motivation to actually think about it. And when we make them do a Google Maps task, submission, we ask them to use a URL shortener and then plot it into a Google Docs form. So Google Docs has forms which are critical for dealing with a submission by 200 students, for example. This is what the form looks like, very simple. Name, metric, group number, URL of your annotated map, and then we ask them for comments. I didn't tell them I was going to ask, I just threw it in, because any form I make always has a, do you have any queries? And so they plot it all in. You can group it, this Google spreadsheets is just like Excel, so you can group it by the lab group numbers and then give the TA to Mark, so the TA is only 15 per group, and then he can provide detailed responses. This is the link, so if you click it, it goes to their map. This is some of the comments that they provided. And the TA is also marked on Google Docs. So this is another assignment. So I just introduced a column, marks out of 1, so it's just a 5-mark primer. And then the marks all get added up. We have a master spreadsheet which has just metric number and total marks. And it's all done. And each TA only has 12 maps to look at. So this is the sort of assignment they did. This is a map exercise that they had to do, plotting all the rivers in Singapore and all the islands. So they've never known, because in a class when I asked them, give me names of rivers. And you think they all shout, well, Singapore River, right? And then they can relax. But they took a long while to get to Singapore River. So it was in shock and horror that I set this assignment. And when I asked them for island names, then they look at you, because it might be a trick question, right? So this was me being vindictive and saying, well, you're going to learn now. And some of them used symbols, which showed that they were getting the feel of the map. And they were asked why this is called Mandai Mangrove when it's next to the causeway. And so they traced the river that feeds the mangrove. Well, okay, at this part it becomes a canal. And then when it enters the nature reserve, it's a stream again. So this stream which they've seen, right, crossing the road, and this mangrove, they don't realize has a connection, right? Because sediment from the forest does get deposited in the mangrove. So if you're doing something upriver, it affects a coastal environment downriver. And then they see the connection now. If you just give it to them in a lecture, you know how they'll nod and not understand anything you said. So this is one of the students, well, she's going to be a teacher in future, so she really embraces everything in class. And she realized we've canalized, but the interesting thing is, I just wanted to point out, I also realized how secretive Singapore government is about releasing information of its maps. Many of the islands were not named. They actually had to hunt through Google using a variety of sources to find out the names of our islands. So applications, well, this was a bunch of them interested in using a bat detector that I purchased but not had time to use. So after term, they took it out, and I said, okay, figure out bat intensity. So they just did it for fun. We have bats in campus, and they're using the radar detector. It steps it down so you can actually hear it. They were trying to figure out where was the site of greatest intensity. So next time we allowed students to borrow it out on their own, using this map, go and sit down at the best spot and wait for the sun to set, and the bats will emerge to hunt for insects. And you realize that this is annotated. So an important thing that we told them was description is critical. Keywords and tags. You can put up amazing resources on the web, but if it can't be found, it's as if it was invisible. So we were very particular right down to the full stops, and they embraced it. This is one student who, after the practical, she was at home, looked out the window and saw some chickens. These are special chickens. Okay, these are more like their ancestor. The call is truncated, and it's got a few of these patches that you don't see in the domestic chicken. And she saw it outside the house, and she was wondering, what on earth is going on? If you read the newspapers on Christmas Day, they featured this work. And so she came to me and said, I want to do a project. And we said, okay, fine, let's look for chickens. And then she started plotting it. Since the newspaper article, there's been a barrage of submissions by the public, and we're going to add it all in, and we're trying to figure out what's going on. One interesting thing is during bird flu, we almost eliminated domestic chickens running around free on Singapore Island. So all you have there, all you have left are these which are closer to the ancestral chicken, which is actually in many parts of Southeast Asia in danger of genetic pollution because they come out of the forest and then they breed with their kampong friends, you know, because they are still the same species. And then your source genes of what gave you the domestic chicken is slowly getting contaminated everywhere. So Singapore might be a pretty good place to conserve its genes. And many of these spots, so some of these are close, not in nature reserves, but they're in state land patches. And they are temporary refugia for these animals. These are otters. So I'm called Otterman because I was working on otters. But when I was working on them, they weren't in Singapore. They came about a year after I submitted my thesis. And so now I finally have a student because there are enough of them to let her pass an oral exam. And she's beginning to plot locations. And you can see there, so she changed her title to Smooth Otter Studies Along the Johor Straits. Before it was Singapore, using the map, she's shortening it down. They were just, a friend of mine just saw 4 of them in Pasir Ris Park yesterday on Facebook. So we just send them a link. They use Google Form and they submit records, which get plotted in and verified with photos. So this is also another student that graduated from the second year class, able to do this. This was a former honor student. She was working on the common palm civet. It's still found in Singapore, mainly in residential areas. There's a big cluster in Siglap. For some reason, if you look at the map history of Siglap, you'll get a clue there used to be a larger forest which receded and somehow the civet population stayed. This is what they look like. She went out initially, couldn't see them, and after a few weeks, plotting on maps, figuring out where to sit down, it walked past her in daytime. So this is her Christmas card, which she sends to everyone. Now I have another student who's working on monitor lizards. They're usually not up the tree, but this is such a wonderful photo I had to show you. They have these long claws, so they can climb up trees and they can burrow. Sungai Buloh has a lot of them. Some of them are over 2 meters, right? So, well, we're not afraid they'll eat children, but they're afraid that without natural predators, they may impact the rest of the ecosystem because the numbers have just been increasing. Or have they? We actually don't know. So we have a student now working with them to figure out distribution and numbers and management strategies. So what next? Well, the map prac was an assignment, right, in practical, and I didn't really have that 2 hours, but it was a quick fix. We did it. So now I realize after 2 semesters that I can make it a tutorial for them to do at home, right, and get them to collaborate in groups. So Eleanor talked about Google Docs collaboration. The students can collaborate on a map as well. And we've got to make it tricky enough so there'll be some excitement as they explore and discover areas. That eliminates the time in the lab, which we've now converted to them going out to Singapore and finding stuff to do. So they have a group project that they do somewhere in Singapore. Instead of confining them in the classroom and looking at the map, we said go out and look at something. And it's working. This is the first year practical. Remember, they've never seen Southern Islands. They didn't know Normanton at the pond. So now instead of just hanging around NUS, we actually walk them all the way to reflections at Bukit Chandu. And during this prac, we now get them to tell us where the plants are. We do a half-an-hour session in the class where we show them the plants. Then they go out and tell the TAs, this is what it is, right? Now we are giving them a map like this, which has little secret stories, which they will learn, and they will tell the rest of the group. So everyone has certain stories they must tell. And when you tell your peers in NUS, they've never heard of any of these stories, right? They've never seen chicken cross the road. So it's pretty easy to tantalize your classmates. And when you have such a wonderful reception, it does wonders for your confidence. This is a bicycle ride I did on Sunday, and we didn't have, well, the iPhones all ran out of battery. So I had to go back and do a plot using Bikely, and I'm trying to figure out how I can incorporate this into a practical that they're going to do on their own, right? Unfortunately, only 1/3 the class, I've sampled about 3 years of classes, is always only about 1/3 who can't cycle at all, right? They got 3 categories, wow, steady, wobbly, and 1/3 is always wobbly. So MParks is creating these park connector networks. So this entire route, you didn't have to fight traffic to cycle a bicycle. And you actually go touring, you can see changes to the topography of Singapore and all that. So I dream of when I can take the class on a cycling tour in this area and point out all the land features and then get them to go back and figure it out on the map. The time will come. I feel that first we'll have to teach 1/3 the class how to cycle. This is Ho Chi Minh City. When I was landing on the plane, I went to visit some friends, just stay in his house. From the plane, I could see how the city had changed. Then I realized why Singapore is so excited about biodiversity index, because as far as cities goes, we have quite a lot of greenery. Previously, we're being compared to countries, and we're being beaten up for doing such a bad job. When we compare to cities, look at that, it's all grey. And then, of course, when you have heavy rain, there's going to be flood, right? So now many of our students travel as never before because it's cheap, they're more affluent. So we ask them, where have you been? And they put up these maps and post it to us on Facebook. Amanda, who's studying the Red Jungle Fowl, she's in McGill University. So she's beginning to plot this is the provost's office, I think. And then that's where she's staying. So she's a little ray of sunshine. And this is thought explosion of where she'll actually be studying. And immediately she realized where the green patch was and can make plans to head out for it. So if they use it in daily life, it'll be better than just being restricted to the classroom. Then they get their spatial awareness. So that's what I've been attempting. It's been interesting as they give us feedback and they tell us they now know where they are. That's really exciting for a teacher. Thank you, everyone.